Imagine walking into a nightmare in the same house you expected peace and family joy after being away for just 3 days. A billionaire comes home unannounced, only to find his fiancée standing over his crying infant son, rage in her eyes and a weapon in her hand. What happens next exposes a darkness no one saw coming and reveals the one person God placed in that house to save an innocent life. The moment he steps through those doors, everything breaks open. Justice, truth, and a faith that refuses to stay silent. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The front doors of the mansion stood wide open that afternoon. Sunlight poured across the marble floors like a spotlight searching for truth. David Hale stepped inside, briefcase still in his hand, his mind already on the son he hadn't held in 3 days. But the sound that greeted him wasn't the usual quiet hum of wealth and order. It was a baby's scream, desperate, terrified. The kind of cry that pierces straight through a father's chest. He moved forward, instinct overriding reason. And then he saw it, the frozen tableau that would haunt him forever. His infant son Noah on the floor, tears streaming down his face. Grace, the young maid, trembling but standing firm, the baby now clutched protectively in her arms. And Pamela, his fiancée, the woman he had chosen to rebuild his broken home, standing there with something sharp in her hand and murder written across her face. In that single moment, David understood something his soul had been whispering for weeks. God had not brought him home late. He had brought him home exactly on time. But to understand how heaven interrupted hell that day, we need to go back. Back to the grief that started it all. Back to the promises made in hospital chapels. Back to the woman who prayed every morning before dawn, believing God had placed her in that house for a reason she couldn't yet see. This is the story of how a billionaire's world shattered and how, in the breaking, divine protection revealed itself through the most unexpected vessel. Let's begin where every great test of faith begins, with loss, love, and the desperate hope that somehow broken pieces can still be made whole. Pamela Martinez had perfected the art of the smile, the kind that photographs beautifully at charity galas, the kind that makes other women envious and men feel chosen. But alone in the mansion's west wing, watching baby Noah sleep in his nursery, that smile dissolved into something else entirely. Something cold, something calculating. She stood at the doorway, arms crossed, studying the child like an equation that refused to balance. 8 months old, helpless, completely dependent, and standing directly between her and everything she had worked for. The thought came again, louder this time. Life would be simpler without him. She tried to push it away, the way she had for weeks. But the resentment had grown roots. Every time David held that child, every time he canceled plans because Noah was teething or fussy or needed him, Pamela felt herself disappearing. She wasn't a partner. She was an accessory to someone else's grief, a replacement for a dead woman she could never compete with. And the money. God, the money. David's estate was worth more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. But with Noah in the picture, Pamela knew exactly how that inheritance would flow. The child would get everything. She would get whatever scraps were left after lawyers and trusts and provisions for the precious son. Unless. The word hung in her mind like a dark invitation. Unless things were different, unless there was no son, unless she was the only one left standing when David's will was read. Pamela's jaw tightened. This wasn't evil. This was survival. This was freedom. She wasn't some monster. She was simply a woman choosing herself for once in her life. The baby stirred in his crib, and Pamela turned away before the thought could fully form into a plan. But it was already too late. The seed had been planted. Down in the kitchen, Grace wiped down the marble countertops with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. Something was wrong. She couldn't name it, couldn't prove it, but the air in the house had changed over the past week. It felt heavier, darker, like a storm building just beyond the horizon. Pamela had started locking doors. Rooms that used to be open were suddenly off limits, and the way she looked at Noah had shifted. There was no warmth there anymore, only irritation, only impatience. Yesterday, Grace had found a kitchen knife on the nursery dresser. When she asked Pamela about it, the woman had smiled that perfect smile and said she must have set it down by mistake while checking on the baby. But Grace had seen her eyes, and they hadn't been mistaken about anything. That night, Grace prayed longer than usual. She knelt beside her small bed in the staff quarters and whispered the same words she'd been whispering for days. Lord, I don't know what's coming, but please protect that child. Please don't let anything happen to Noah. Use me if you need to. I'm here. I'm listening. She didn't know if God heard prayers from people like her. Housemaids, invisible women who cleaned other people's messes and raised other people's children. But she prayed anyway. Because sometimes faith was all you had when the darkness started pressing in. 300 miles away, David Hale sat in an airport terminal, staring at the departure board with growing unease. His flight had been delayed, then delayed again. The business meetings he'd flown out for had been abruptly canceled due to a sudden family emergency on the client's side. Everything about this trip felt wrong, disjointed, like the universe itself was trying to redirect him. He checked his phone. No messages from Pamela. No updates about Noah. Just silence. And then, like a whisper in his spirit, a memory surfaced. Scripture his mother used to quote when he was a boy. While you were sleeping, I was working. David stood abruptly, grabbing his briefcase. He didn't understand it, couldn't explain it, but every instinct in his body was screaming the same message. Go home now. He booked the next flight out without a second thought. Back at the mansion, the afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the floors. Pamela moved through the house with purpose now, her decision made. Grace was in the kitchen, busy with laundry. The staff had the day off. David wasn't due back until Friday. It was just her and the baby. She climbed the stairs slowly, her heart pounding, but her mind strangely calm. This was necessary. This was right. She would be free. They both would. David would grieve, yes, but eventually he would move on. And she would be there. The only one left. Pamela pushed open the nursery door. Noah was awake, staring up at the mobile above his crib. When he saw her, he didn't smile. Babies knew things. They could sense what adults tried to hide. She reached for him, her hands steady. But as she lifted him, Noah began to cry. Not the usual fussing. Something deeper, louder, a wail that seemed to pierce through the walls themselves. Downstairs, Grace froze mid-fold, a towel clutched in her hands. That cry. It wasn't normal. It was the sound of pure fear. Her feet moved before her mind caught up. She dropped everything and ran, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't know what she would find. She only knew she had to get there. As she reached the staircase, she heard Pamela's voice, low, tight, venomous. And then, through the crack in the nursery door, Grace saw the glint of something metallic, something sharp, something that didn't belong in a baby's room. Grace didn't think, didn't plan, didn't calculate the cost. She burst through the doorway, and in that moment, the storm finally broke. The nursery door slammed against the wall as Grace burst through, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The scene before her was a nightmare carved into daylight. Pamela stood over Noah's crib, the baby screaming on the mattress below, his tiny fists reaching upward in desperation. In Pamela's hand, a pair of sewing scissors gleamed under the afternoon light, the sharp points angled downward. Grace didn't hesitate. She threw herself forward, scooping Noah into her arms and spinning away, using her own body as a shield between the child and whatever darkness had possessed the woman she'd once called ma'am. The baby's cries pressed against her chest, his heart racing like a trapped bird. "Jesus, please," Grace whispered, clutching Noah tighter. "Please, Jesus." Pamela's face twisted into something unrecognizable. The mask she'd worn for months shattered completely, and what emerged was pure, unchecked rage. Her perfectly styled hair had come loose, her designer dress wrinkled, but it was her eyes that betrayed the truth. They were empty, hollow, the eyes of someone who had already made peace with the unthinkable. "Give him to me." Pamela's voice was barely human, low and venomous and trembling with fury. "You have no idea what you just did." Grace backed toward the wall, her arms locked around Noah. "Miss Pamela, please, put that down. This isn't you. You don't know anything about me." Pamela stepped forward, the scissors still gripped in her white-knuckled fist. "You're just the help, a nobody who cleans floors and folds laundry. You think you matter here? You think anyone will believe you over me?" "I don't need anyone to believe me." Grace's voice shook but held firm. "God sees everything, and he's not going to let you do this." Pamela laughed. It was a sound without joy, without sanity. "God? You think God cares about any of this? Where was God when I had to smile and pretend to love a child that isn't mine? Where was God when David chose a dead woman over me every single day?" She moved closer, and Grace pressed her back against the wall, shielding Noah with everything she had. "This ends today," Pamela hissed, "one way or another." And then the front door opened downstairs. The sound echoed through the mansion like a bell tolling judgment. Footsteps on marble, steady, purposeful, coming closer. Pamela froze, her face draining of color. David Hale appeared in the nursery doorway, briefcase still in his hand, his suit rumpled from travel. For 3 long seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. Time itself seemed to stop, holding space for truth to finally step into the light. David's eyes swept the room. His son, red-faced and sobbing, clutched in Grace's trembling arms. Grace, backed against the wall, terror and defiance warring in her expression, and Pamela, standing in the center of it all, with scissors in her hand and guilt written across every inch of her face. The silence was louder than any scream. "Put it down." David's voice was quiet, too quiet, the kind of calm that came before earthquakes. "Now." Pamela's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. "David, you weren't supposed to. This isn't what it looks like." "Put it down." The scissors clattered to the floor. David stepped into the room, his gaze never leaving Pamela's face, but when he spoke again, his voice had changed. There was something else there now, something that came from deeper than anger, deeper than betrayal. "My wife died bringing that child into this world." His words were slow, deliberate, each one a stone laid in the foundation of judgment. "She gave everything so he could live. And God, in his mercy, let me keep him when I deserved to lose them, both." Pamela backed away, shaking her head. "David, please, you don't understand. It's been so hard. I've tried. I've really tried, but stop." David held up his hand, and she went silent. "I trusted you. I brought you into our lives because I thought you would help us heal. I thought you loved him, loved us." "I do." The lie came out broken, desperate. "I love you, David. That's why this is so hard. He's always between us. Always. And I needed him gone so we could finally be enough." The word cut through her spiral like a blade. David walked past Pamela without looking at her and moved toward Grace, who was still pressed against the wall, tears streaming down her face as she held Noah tight. "Give him to me," David said softly. Grace hesitated, then carefully transferred the baby into his father's arms. Noah's cries began to quiet immediately, his tiny hands gripping David's shirt as if anchoring himself to solid ground. David held his son close, eyes closed, lips moving in what might have been prayer or simply relief. When he opened them again, he looked at Grace with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for being here, for hearing him, for not looking away." Grace shook her head, sobs breaking through. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hale. I'm so sorry. I should have seen this sooner. I should have told you. I almost let... You saved his life." David's voice was firm now, leaving no room for doubt. "You heard his cry, and you ran toward danger instead of away from it. Do you understand what that means?" Grace wiped her face with shaking hands. "I was just doing what anyone would..." "No!" David glanced heavenward, his jaw tight with emotion. "God sent you before I arrived. He placed you here for this moment, and I will spend the rest of my life thanking him that you were brave enough to answer." Behind them, Pamela crumpled to the floor, her sobs echoing through the room. But there was no redemption in them, only the sound of consequences finally arriving. David pulled out his phone with his free hand, never letting go of Noah. "I'm calling the police, and then I'm calling my lawyer. This engagement is over. You'll leave this house today, and you'll never come near my son again." Pamela looked up, mascara streaming down her face. "David, please. I wasn't really going to... I just wanted to scare him, that's all. I swear I said enough." David's voice didn't rise, but the authority in it silenced every protest. "Grace will testify. The truth will be told, and whatever happens next will be between you, the law, and God." Within an hour, the mansion filled with people, police, lawyers, staff members recalled from their day off. Pamela was escorted out in handcuffs, still trying to explain, still trying to rewrite the story, even as the evidence condemned her. And, through it all, David held his son, held him, and thanked God that he'd come home early, that flights had been delayed, that meetings had been canceled, that a humble maid had prayed every morning and meant every word. When the house finally emptied and silence returned, David found Grace sitting in the kitchen, staring at her hands as if she didn't recognize them. He sat down across from her, Noah asleep against his shoulder. "God sent you before I arrived," he said again, his voice thick with gratitude and grief. "Do you believe that?" Grace looked up, fresh tears spilling over. "I was so scared I'd be too late." "But you weren't." David reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You were exactly on time." 3 days later, the mansion felt different. The darkness that had pressed against the walls like an unwelcome guest had finally lifted. Light poured through the windows again, unfiltered and warm. The air no longer carried the weight of secrets. The house could breathe. David stood in the nursery doorway, watching Noah sleep peacefully in his crib. The baby's chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, his tiny fists curled beside his head. Safe, whole, alive. But David couldn't shake the image that haunted him every time he closed his eyes. Pamela standing over his son with murder in her heart. Grace throwing herself between darkness and innocence. The moment he'd almost been too late. He sank into the rocking chair beside the crib, his head in his hands. All his wealth, all his power, all his carefully constructed plans. None of it had protected the person who mattered most. He'd been so desperate to rebuild what he'd lost that he'd invited danger straight through the front door. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the sleeping child. I almost chose wrong. I almost let someone hurt you because I was too afraid to be alone. The guilt was a physical thing, pressing down on his shoulders. He'd failed his son, failed his late wife's memory, failed the promise he'd made in that hospital chapel the day Noah was born. But God hadn't failed. Even when David's judgment had been clouded by grief and loneliness, even when he'd trusted the wrong person, even when everything hung by a thread, God had been working, delaying flights, canceling meetings, placing a faithful woman in the right place at the right time. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Grace stood in the doorway, hesitant as always. She'd been quieter than usual these past few days, moving through the house like someone afraid to take up too much space. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mr. Hale. I just wanted to check if you needed anything." David looked at her, really looked at her. 27 years old, kind eyes, calloused hands from years of work most people never noticed. She'd been in his house for 8 months, caring for his son, praying for their safety, and he'd barely known her name. "Grace, sit down, please." He gestured to the chair across from him. She hesitated. "Sir, I shouldn't—" "Please." She sat, folding her hands in her lap, her eyes downcast. David leaned forward. "I need to say something, and I need you to hear it. What you did 3 days ago, that wasn't just bravery. That was love. The kind of love that doesn't calculate cost or consider consequences. You could have been hurt. You could have lost your job. But you ran toward my son anyway. I just did what anyone would—" "No." David's voice was firm but gentle. Most people would have frozen or run away or convinced themselves it wasn't their business. But you heard his cry and you ran. And because of that, my son is alive. Grace's eyes filled with tears. "I was so afraid I'd be too late." "But you weren't. God heard your prayers, Grace. Every morning before work, every whispered plea for Noah's protection. He heard all of it, and when the moment came, he used you." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "I'm just a maid, Mr. Hale. I don't have money or power or education. I'm nobody special." "You're wrong." David's voice cracked with emotion. "You're exactly who God needed you to be. Not because of what you have, but because of who you are. Your faith, your courage, your refusal to look away when evil showed its face." He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the sprawling estate. "I've spent my whole life building things, companies, wealth, legacy. I thought that's what would keep us safe. But all the money in the world couldn't save my son. It took someone who knew how to pray, someone who still believed God answers." Grace sat quietly, letting his words settle. David turned back to her. "I want to offer you something. Not payment, not a reward. Those words don't begin to cover what you've done, but security, a future. I'll pay for your education, whatever you want to study. I'll make sure you never have to worry about money or housing or opportunity again. And if you choose to stay here, you won't be the maid anymore. You'll be part of this family, because that's what you've already become." Grace shook her head, tears streaming freely now. "Mr. Hale, I don't need all that. I just need to know Noah is safe. That's enough for me." "But it's not enough for me." David's voice was resolute. "Let me honor what you did. Let me show you that your faith and sacrifice matter. Please." She looked at Noah, sleeping peacefully in his crib, then back at David. "If I stay because I love that child. Not because of anything you can give me." "I know," David said softly. "That's exactly why I'm asking." Over the following weeks, the house transformed. The shadows that had lurked in corners disappeared. Noah laughed more. His giggles echoed through rooms that had been silent too long. The staff returned with lighter steps. Even the sunlight seemed brighter. David spent more time at home. He'd learned the hard way that success meant nothing if you weren't present for the people you loved. He fed Noah breakfast, changed diapers, read stories in voices that made his son shriek with delight, and Grace became what she'd always been in her heart, Noah's protector, his guardian, his second mother. One evening, David found her in the garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and gold. He stood beside her, Noah balanced on his hip. "I've been thinking about something," David said, "about that day, about how close we came to losing everything." Grace nodded, her expression peaceful. "God's timing is perfect, even when we can't see it." "You really believe that, don't you?" "I have to," she said simply. "Otherwise, none of this makes sense. The delays, the canceled meetings, the way I heard Noah's cry from all the way downstairs. It wasn't coincidence, Mr. Hale. It was mercy." David adjusted Noah in his arms, pressing a kiss to his son's head. "I used to think God worked through grand gestures, miracles that everyone could see. But that's not what happened here, is it?" Grace smiled. "Sometimes the biggest miracles look like ordinary people doing what love requires." They stood in comfortable silence as Noah reached for his father's face, patting his cheeks with chubby hands. And in that moment, David understood something profound, something that would change how he saw everything going forward. God didn't send an angel to save his son. He sent a woman who woke up every morning and chose to pray, who noticed when doors were locked and knives were misplaced, who heard a baby's cry and ran toward danger because love gave her no other choice. He sent someone who refused to look away. And sometimes, David realized, that was the most powerful miracle of all.